So going over the agenda, we're going to start off with introductions, getting to know who we are and just setting the space. Then we're going to be discussing like a quick Philippines 101 with some background information. Then we're going to get into a bulk of Philippine history and class society to understand the context and the situation within the Philippines. And then we'll be discussing through basic problems, how they plague Philippine society and what the effects they have on them. And then we're going to go into what is the solution? What does that look like today in the Philippines and abroad? And we're going to bring it back to from the Philippines to Philadelphia. What can we do here in Philly to aid the movement in the Philippines? We can go to the next slide, yeah. So if we go to the next slide, we can do like a quick check-in. If you are here in the chat, you can put your names, pronouns, affiliations, and expectations for today. And then I would like all the facilitators just to go around and verbally like say this information. So I'll start. My name is Rhiannon. I'm going to be one of the facilitators today. I am the Secretary General of Anakbayan Philadelphia. I also have affiliations with PHL Laundry Support, which is a mutual aid group in Philadelphia. And my expectations today are to teach this to like a new group of people and see what ways we can engage in the struggle in the Philippines and have more people support the movement. And so I'll pass it on to any other facilitator who wants to introduce themselves.
I can go next. My name is Remy. I am the education officer of AB Philly. I use she, her pronouns, and I guess other affiliations. I'm an artist and I work in the hospitality industry. And expectations for this lesson today is to just sort of share the Philippine struggle with other folks that might not be familiar and see how we could sort of engage with that struggle here in Philadelphia. So yeah, and whoever wants to go next can go now.
I can go next. Hi, I'm Astrid. I'm a member of AB Philly. See, I use they, them pronouns, and I'm excited to brainstorm some ways that we'll first learn more about the history of the Philippines and the struggle and brainstorm ways that, yeah, some things we can do together. And I'm really excited about this collaboration between DSA and AB Philly.
Hey, comrades, I'll go next. I'm on Lin Wang, EM pronouns, and with PhillyDSA. I serve on the steering committee here, and I also lead our Tax the Rich committee as well. I also, my other role I have in DSA is I am a co-chair of the Asia and Oceania subcommittee for DSA's international committee as well. Thanks everyone for being here. I think Ket is a remaining presenter who still has to go.
Oh, I think it's just Tarig left.
Yeah, I'm Tarig, he, him pronouns. I'm a member of PhillyDSA's Political Education Committee, and I'm also a member of DSA's International Committee. And guess I'm excited to learn a lot. Hope to hear some interesting questions or conversations. Is there anyone next? Or cool.
We can move on to the next slide, which is going to be like a space setting. So the goals for today are sharing and uplifting Philippine cultural history from pre-colonial society until today. I think it's really important Filipinos and non-Filipinos alike learn about this history and understand that there was a prosperous, beautiful society and culture before colonialization. And then we're also going to be acknowledging the history of struggle and revolution in the Philippines and learning how we in Philadelphia can aid in the current struggle. We're also going to be discussing colonization and war, along with the side effects and effects of that. So before several slides, we will be giving a content warning. If for any reason folks need to leave, you may do so, whether that's to take some space for yourself, to get water, food, go to the bathroom or whatever. Please feel free to do so at any time. And we encourage you to engage. If you have any questions, please direct them to our question person. If you look at the participants, there's someone whose name says questions. Direct message them any questions you have, they'll post them in the chat. And then at the end, if there's any questions we haven't covered, we will hold a space to have a live Q&A. And this is an opportunity to learn, but also an opportunity to take action and be engaged. At the end, we're going to be brainstorming some ideas of how this group and how other people can get engaged in the Philippines. So when the time comes, please feel free to share then.
All right, so I'm going to lead us through a land acknowledgement. So PSR, Philippine Society and Revolution, while being held virtually, is bringing us together on occupied Lenape land. Lenape people were hunters, fisherfolk, and cultivated the area around Philadelphia along the banks of what are now called the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers. They are the past, present, and future stewards of this land. Both the US and the Philippines share a long history of colonization. We refuse the settler colonial lie that Columbus discovered America, just as we know that Magellan did not discover what we understand today as the Philippines. During the periods of forced occupation by Spain and the US, continuing to the present day, many Filipinos experienced a loss of land, culture, and identity, as well as forced displacement within the islands and across the diaspora for reasons economic, political, and otherwise. And so to this day, the indigenous people in their fight for land sovereignty in the Philippines remind us that decolonization remains a vital and violent struggle. In our hearts, minds, and spirits, we wish to acknowledge, respect, and support the empowerment of indigenous people both here and in the Philippines. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, Astrid. So I'm going to give a brief overview of who we are as Anakbayan Philly. So we are the Philadelphia chapter of Anakbayan, an international organization that started in the Philippines in 1998. Anakbayan would translate to Children of the Nation. The Philadelphia chapter, we started in June of 2020, so our 2-year anniversary is coming up, which absolutely blows my mind. Anakbayan is a youth and student-led organization, and we work to educate, organize, and mobilize our community to address important issues that affect Filipinos in the US and in the Philippines. We aim to unite Filipinx and non-Filipinx youth ages 13 to 35 and of all backgrounds in order to achieve genuine freedom and democracy in the Philippines. Our members are very diverse. We range from Drexel students, Temple students, law students, non-students. We have art and cultural workers, healthcare workers, event programmers, and more. We put together artist events, social solidarity work, protests. We do campaigning and teach-ins such as this one. And one of our most foundational studies is similar to this one, but a lot longer and a lot more in depth, called Philippine Society and Revolution, or as you may hear it, PSR. So I'm going to do a quick rundown of some campaigns we as ABUSA are waging. So one of our first ones is Save Our Schools, or SOS. This seeks to bring justice and sovereignty to the Lamont schools, which are a group of indigenous schools in the Philippines as they face threats and backlash from the Duterte regime. Another one of our campaigns is Be Amado. Amado Kaya was a powerful and passionate Kasama moved to the Philippines to live with and support indigenous communities there. He passed away in August of 2020. This campaign works to encapsulate and honor his fighting and loving spirit and encourage Kasamas and comrades all over the world. Another one, the campaign that you'll probably hear a lot about towards the end of this meeting is the Philippine Human Rights Act, or the PHRA. The PHRA is a legislative bill that calls for the end of funding by the US government to the Philippines for military operation. There's a lot of involvement from a lot of people all over the United States fighting for this. It's a good way to get involved. And we recently have been talking a lot about the elections. The elections in the Philippines are coming up on May 9th. And Anakbayan is really pushing to prevent a Marcos Duterte regime because Ferdinand Marcos and Sara Duterte are the children of some of the most violent, infamous dictators of the Philippines. And to continue to fight against the voter fraud that is already apparent in these elections. And then these next couple slides are photos of events we've been to. We've done a martial law art build. The one phone in the middle with all those people, that was People's State of the Nation address, where we have members of the National Democratic Movement from all over the Northeast come together in a protest. We've done banner drops, we do potlucks. There's protests held at the consulate, and we also do solidarity work. That photo in the corner was with the organization Korea Peace Now. And we can go to the next slide then. Yep. And then in this slide, just photos from like our most recent GA and an event we did at the Swinkle Center. looking at art and interacting with the Filipino Folk Art Society. So we do organize together and we do political work together, but we also like to have just regular time together and really build as communities and kasamas. So I'm gonna just give an introduction to what actually PSR is. So the study of PSR is based on the book Philippine Society and Revolution by Jose Maria Sison. You may also hear to him being referred to as Joma. And this book was published in the 1970s during the upsurge of the anti-Marcos movement. Many groups discuss the problems of Philippine society and the solution. This book presents a unified way on why the Philippines is the way it is and how to move forward within the revolution. Ideas from these books came from real actual study of the material conditions of Philippine society and the development of the society from the oppressed Filipino masses. It was consciously designed to produce revolutionaries, and it paved the way for a strong resistance movement in the Philippines. This analysis, despite being written in the 1970s, is still valid and relevant to today. It's something, as AB internally, we do a short course study on it, which is 8 hours long. This is a super micro version of it. And then just a little more background on the author. His pen name was Amado Guerrera, but his real name is Jose Maria Sison, and he was the founder of the Kabatang Macbayan in 1964, which was a revolutionary organization of Filipino youth that formed in response to the crisis of Philippine society under the Marcos regime. Next, I'm going to be passing it over to my kasama Astrid to cover this section.
Thanks, Rhiannon. So in this section, we're just going to cover some basic information about the Philippines, where it is, sort of the makeup of the society, and some facts. All right. So some characteristics of Philippines. Philippines is located in Southeast Asia, located neighboring Malaysia. These are sort of the islands isolated, but pretend it's like the rest of Asia is there. It's an archipelago. It's made up of over 7,641 islands, although as like the tides shifts and go up and down, maybe there's more islands, maybe there's less. And in the total landmass, can be compared to the state of Arizona. And in the Philippines, there are over 200 recorded languages. So these islands can be broken up into 3 main groups: Luzon in the north, Visayas, and Mindanao in the south. And of the 200 languages, these are the 5 most popular languages spoken: Ilocano, Tagalog, Bicolano, Cebuano, and Kanan. And to go through the makeup of Filipino society, 75% of Filipino people live in the countryside. 25% live in the urban cities. And 10% live overseas, with 4 million being undocumented in the US. The Filipino diaspora is one of the largest in the world. In the indigenous population, there are 10 million indigenous equals, with 40 tribes and many more sub-tribes, including the Igorot, Ada, Mangyan, and Santuro. Some of the natural resources in the Philippines are rice, tropical fruits, seafood fishing, oil, lumber, and gold and other minerals. So an abundance of natural resources, which leads us to the question posed by Amado Guerrero or Joma. If the natural wealth of the Philippines were to be tapped and developed by the Filipino people themselves for their own benefit, it'd be more than enough to sustain a population that is several times bigger than the present one. And so that leads us to sort of the thesis of the first part, which is the Philippines is rich, but the people are poor. And so that begs us to ask the question, why is that? And this is kind of the overview of how the society is broken up in this class triangle. As you can see on the bottom, 75% of the peasant class, the 15% the workers, 7 to 8% the petty bourgeoisie, and then you have a national like bourgeoisie, and the top you have the comprador bourgeoisie and those serving imperialist powers. And so I think this class triangle is important to look at in Philippine society because here in the US, we don't really have a peasant class, whereas in the Philippines, that is the largest class in society.
Okay, thank you, Astrid. Now I'm going to be doing like a speed run of Philippine history and class society. So in like, well, me and Rhiannon are tag teaming it, but in the next 20 minutes, you're going to hear about all of Philippine history from pre-colonial to the present. So let's get started. So the main question that we want to ask ourselves is, how did we go from this, which is an image of Lapu-Lapu killing Magellan as he is in the middle of circumnavigating the earth, to this, Manny Pacquiao running for president in the Philippine election? Like, how do the heroes of like the Philippines change so drastically and so in such a backwards manner? Like, how did we get like this? So again, we're covering from the pre-colonial era to the present. It's going to be a lot. If you have questions, remember to direct them to questions. So we're going to start with the pre-colonial Philippines, so up to 1521. So obviously, before Spain, the Philippines wasn't called the Philippines. It was just a bunch of indigenous societies throughout the archipelago that had various relationships with one another. They had basic industries and production, such as gold, lumber, pottery, metals, rice, agriculture, and fabrics. And alongside being traded like within the archipelago, there's also trade established with modern day countries like China, Greece, Japan, Arab countries, Vietnam, and others. And in addition to that, the Philippines had literature and ancient writing systems based on South Indian Brahmic scripts. And the most well-known and documented one is Baybayin, which some people still teach themselves and practice to this day. And all of this to say is that before colonizers came to the Philippines, and even though they treated Filipinos like they were uncivilized, the people of the Philippines already had many developed sectors and cultures. So the fact that we get taught that the Philippines was like this primitive like land of just like nothingness is just absolutely false. And that's kind of the main point that we want to push in this section. So we like to show people this picture. It's like a depiction of like a spiritual ceremony in an indigenous community. And something we like to point out is that the ceremony is actually being led by a woman. And the reason this is kind of significant is because the Philippines like current culture is kind of known for being like patriarchal, but we know that that's sort of something that was bestowed upon them by colonization and that it wasn't always a patriarchal society. A lot of indigenous societies didn't like demonstrate that sort of like mindset at all. So that's just like one way that colonization like completely changed the Philippines. And let's see, please go to the next slide. Wait, go back. Okay. So you might be asking yourself, what were some of these indigenous social systems that were in place? Well, there's like three broad categories. So the first one is primitive communal, which is the lowest form of social organization with no private ownership of land. And this existed amongst Ita tribes. The second was semi-slave, which was the most widespread system, which was organized into barangays, and there's private and communal land ownership. And then the third was feudal, which was the most developed social system, which was most prevalent in Mindanao. And there's a clear hierarchy where sultans owned the land and datus managed the land. And so we're telling you this to demonstrate that there were social systems in place, but also to say that like we're not necessarily advocating that we go back to like the primitive or anything like that, because these social systems that were in place had their own issues even before colonization. Like there is still a little feudalism, a little bit of like a semi-slave like social system. So like we're just kind of trying to provide like broader context of what existed. But the main point is the Philippines was a variety of different civilizations with their own cultures, trades, technologies, and relations to one another. And unlike we are told, they are not primitive societies that were bettered by their colonizers. And so that brings us into their colonizers. So Spanish colonization from 1521 to 1898. So why did Spain gain control of the Philippines? And this is sort of the reason that even exists today, is like the geographical location of the Philippines is just strategic for trade and politics. As we mentioned before, the Philippines is rich in natural resources. And so obviously people want to extract those resources for their own gain. And so, yeah, after, how did Spain change the Philippines? So the Spanish changed the economic and social structures of the Philippines by introducing feudalism. So even though there was like the feudal social structure that I mentioned before, this is like widespread feudalism. So instead of land being used to sustain a community or people, it was used to grow crops that would generate profit for whoever owned the land. And the way that they gained control of the Philippines is like the sword and cross method. So basically they used religion and straight up violence in order to take land and sort of claim it as their own. So the Spanish began land grabbing by using religion to claim land from ancestral territories and then also stake claim over unclaimed territory. So these are some ways that Spain spread feudalism. So the encomienda system, which is the combination of barangays into encomiendas. And there's awards for colonial officers and friars for services to the Spanish throne. And this was profitable because of collected taxes, cheap labor, and supply of soldiers. The second one is polo y servicio. So all men 12 years and older were forced into mandatory labor for 40 days straight to clear forests for lumber and build ships for trade to fight off Spain's enemy, Portugal. Then there's the hacienda system. So large scale cultivation of cash crop for export and trade. And lastly, puppet rulers. The Spanish colonists gave the former rajas and datus certain powers in the municipalities and barangays. So basically just like trying to get people to sell out to the colonizer in order to gain control, which is something that still exists to this day, which we'll get into later. But despite all this oppression, the Philippines never backed down. They fought back, just like Lapu-Lapu the first time that Magellan landed on Philippine soil. So there are over 200 revolts launched during Spanish colonization. And this picture is like really pixelated, but it's just like describing some of them. And the upper class also tried to wage revolts. So there's the Gamburza, which was a secularization movement that took part in a protest in Cavite that fought against low wages for port workers, but they were executed briefly after. And then most notably the Ilustrados, which a lot of people might have heard of, Jose Rizal, who's like a famous author. They were revolutionary, but they didn't want to be separated from Spain. They wanted to be included in Spanish government affairs and to be a province in Spain. And they didn't advocate for armed revolution. They just kind of were reformists. And they're from the upper class and not the working class. And this is largely why we believe they failed. So these two revolts, even though they are notable, they failed because they were bourgeois. And even though they failed, they did succeed in instilling a sense of nationalism within Filipinos. So that's like one takeaway that we get from that. But there are other revolutionary movements that continued despite the failure of those. So the Katipunan was a secret underground organization that was formed to unite Filipinos against Spain. The membership reached upwards to 30,000, spreading across the country. And they were actually an armed revolution that wanted complete independence from Spain. And this was led by Andres Bonifacio, who founded the Katipunan. And that's actually where we get our name, because like if you see at the end, Anakbayan. So yeah. Andres Bonifacio was actually from the working class, and he led a revolution for national independence from the Philippines. And this was just because there's intensifying exploitation and oppression in the Philippines. So the desire to have like national democracy kind of was heightening. And this led to the Philippine Revolution of 1896, which was the first nationwide revolution. So a lot of the revolts before this were kind of sporadic, and they weren't like throughout the whole country. So this was the first nationwide one. And this again happened because exploitation was intensifying under Spain. And it was an armed struggle that fought for land redistribution. So it wasn't like bourgeois reformist politics. But there are still issues that caused this like revolution to not like completely reach fruition. So in 1897, the Katipunan split into two. One faction led by Bonifacio and the other one led by Aguinaldo. And basically what happened was Aguinaldo was a bit of a sellout and people kind of favored him because they were like, oh, he has the education of a lawyer and Bonifacio doesn't. He's just like this peasant. And then basically Aguinaldo sold out and had Bonifacio executed. And that's kind of largely why the revolution didn't like completely succeed. So Aguinaldo basically is like, I don't know, a traitor, but people were still revolting despite that. But basically what ended up happening, and we'll like kind of get into it more, but the Spanish-American War was breaking out at the time. So they were losing foothold in a lot of territories. And this was like causing them to be very vulnerable. But at the same time, the US was a rising imperialist power at the time. And so the combination of Spain weakening, the US rising, and then Aguinaldo sort of selling out to colonizers is why they didn't completely gain independence, which I'll get into in a minute. But before I transition to the US's role and how they related with Aguinaldo, I'll just do a summary of Spain. So yeah, Spain wanted the Philippines because it was fertile. Spain conquered the Philippines. They spread feudalism. There was revolts throughout, but nothing that completely reached fruition, obviously. And yeah, so we'll go into the colonial rule of US imperialism and the Philippine struggle against it. So basically, okay, hold on. The slide is transitioning. Hello. So how did the US gain control of the Philippines? So like I said before, the Spanish-American War started, they were losing territories. The US was rising in power. In May of 1898, George Dewey sailed to the Philippines and worked with Spain to stage a mock battle. The US pushed Aguinaldo to delay the final blow so that the US could gather troops and claim credit for the Spanish surrender. So actually the Filipino revolutionaries were about to defeat their colonizer, but because Aguinaldo sold out and the US was this rising imperialist power, that didn't completely happen. So yeah, in June 12th of that year, Aguinaldo made a proclamation of independence of the Philippine Republic under the protection of the mighty and humane North American nation. So yeah, boo Aguinaldo, we don't like him. And so yeah, the Treaty of Paris, which some of you might be familiar with, was basically how we're taught that the US acquired the Philippines. We don't get told about the mock battle and everything. We just get told that Spain sold the Philippines for $20 million and also gave up Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Guam. So yeah. The Philippine-American War broke out in 1899, and this is because obviously the Filipinos were this close to defeating their 300-year colonizer, so they weren't about to just give up. So US troops launched a surprise attack on Filipino revolutionary forces in Manila, and at least 3,000 Filipinos were killed. And this war went on for a while because the people wanted national liberation. So, sorry, the slide is not changing again on my computer. Okay, so by 1902, over 125,000 troops were sent to the Philippines. In October 1901, General Jacob Smith ordered to kill everyone over 10. He said, "I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better. It will please me. I want all persons who are capable of bearing arms in actual hostilities against the United States." So over 1 million Filipinos died either in war or because of diseases that were brought from the war. There's burning of homes, villages, massacres, violence against women. There was a massacre of Filipino Muslims. So this was like a very violent, very long war that killed a lot of Filipino people. And just content warning for the next slide, because there are of this like brutality. And then in the upper right, this is like the comic that's describing General Jacob Smith's order that I just read. So yeah. Okay, sorry, my like computer is being weird with switching the slides. But anyway, so why and how did the US maintain the feudalism that Spain introduced in the Philippines? So they earned support of the local elite. They had a steady supply of raw materials and a market for imperialist products, and they used cheap labor. They maintained the hacienda system. They gave power to landlords. They enacted laws that exploited peasants. They basically used the Philippines as a dumping ground for US products, and the exploitation in the feudal countryside created a large reserve army of labor. So how did the US perpetuate its colonial rule? So the first way is counter-revolutionary violence, and then the second is deception. So basically, the US strengthened its armed forces, which it still has a very large array of armed forces in the Philippines today, which we'll get into later. And they crushed the leadership of the revolution, which was kind of described earlier with Aguinaldo. And then they trained puppets to run the country, which still happens to this day. And then another way that the U kind of maintained power back then and still maintains it to this day is through like a sort of cultural imperialism. So they controlled the thinking of the people by crushing their nationalist and revolutionary spirit. And yeah, there's this quote that says, "The most effective means of subjugating a people is to capture their minds. Education therefore serves as a weapon in the wars of colonial conquest." And yeah, so the US shipped over a bunch of teachers called Thomasites to teach like American exceptionalist curriculum. There's also a pensionado program where they sent Filipino students to America to get an education, but they really kind of indoctrinated them so that they could be like future puppet people. And then they also utilized media control. And now I'm going to pass it off to Rhiannon to talk about Japanese occupation of the Philippines.
Thank you, Remy. So during the Great Depression, it triggered instability in the capitalist nations, and many turned to imperialist expansion to support their economy and their rule. Japan turned its imperialist control to Asia. Japan launched an attack on the Philippines on December 8th in 1941, just 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The initial aerial bombardments was followed by the landings of ground troops in North and South Manila. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. So how did Japan conquer the Philippines? The Japanese forces occupied Manila in 1942. The US imperialists did not put up an all-out defense of the Philippines because they were busy fighting the war in Europe. The bureaucratic capitalists, the comprador big bourgeoisie, and the big landlords were split into two factions. One faction sided with the US imperialists and joined their escape when they headed to Washington. The other side sided with the new imperialist masters. With the help of traders headed by Jose Laurel, the Japanese occupiers set up a puppet government in the Philippines. Then, in 1943, the occupiers granted fake independence to the Philippines. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so there's just going to be a warning for discussion of sexual violence on the next slide, just so everyone is aware. So one of the ways that Japan enacted violence upon the Philippines and a lot of Southeast Asia was by forcing women into sexual slavery. These terms were called comfort women. This is used to describe over 200,000 girls and women who were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military during the Second World War in Asia. The Japanese also stole a lot of property and land from the Filipinos and enacted great violence against them. But once again, as throughout history, the Filipinos stood up and they fought back and they got organized. Even before the arrival of Japan, the Communist Party in the Philippines led a broad movement to boycott Japanese products. Once Japan occupied the Philippines, guerrilla warfare flared up in all the provinces. The Communist Party established the Anakbayan Laban sa Hapon, which would be translated as People's Army Against the Japanese. A common short term for it would just be Hakbalahap. And this group was formed on March 29th in 1942. This group led an armed struggle over a large part of central and southern Luzon. And if you remember, Luzon is one of the uppermost island areas in the Philippines. And then within the cities, there's a broad underground movement that was formed to support the guerrilla armies in various ways. And the Huks actually did inspire Jose Maria Sison a lot on his path towards becoming a revolutionary. So just to do a quick summary of Japanese occupation, the Great Depression triggered a crisis in the capitalist imperial country of the world. Fascism rose in Italy, Japan. Because it's supported by monopoly capitalists in those countries, Japan then invaded the Philippines in order to save itself from great economic crisis. In the Philippines, they committed outrageous war atrocities against Filipinos by the confiscation of belongings, property, killings, beheadings, and the forced sexual slavery of over 1,000 Filipino women and young girls. The Hakbalahap formed in response to this Japanese imperialist oppression. The Philippines was granted its independence from the United States on July 4th, 1946. However, the Philippines is not truly free from US rule or its colonial past. There's still effects of this as we see it today. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in this next section then. So We're going to be going over different ways the US enacts its control over the Philippines. And we can go to the next slide. Yep. So the Philippines is a semi-colonial nation, meaning that while it's technically free of colonial controls, there's still heavy influence from US imperialism. One way this is seen is through the puppet governments. Here are 3 presidents of the Philippines. First, Ferdinand Marcos. He was a fascist and a dictator who established martial law in the 1960s and 70s. Under him, thousands and thousands of revolutionaries were killed, tortured, and imprisoned. Jose Maria Sison himself was imprisoned during this time. And his son, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos, is now running to reestablish the Marcos regime in the Philippines in this upcoming election. Another puppet government president was Cory Aquino. She was kind of seen as being more progressive, as making these promises to bring more to the Philippines and to the Filipino people. She was from the bourgeoisie lord family, and she had different interests than the people. One such event was the Mendiola massacre, in which farmers protested because of false land reforms they were promised. In this, dozens of peasants were killed. And now to today, Rodrigo Duterte, he's the current sitting president of the Philippines. Under his regime, almost 30,000 people have been killed between his attacks against communists, and activists, and also his war on drugs, where he, anyone who does drugs, anyone who sells drugs, he has committed to going to war against them. And his daughter, Sara Duterte, is currently running as the vice president of the Philippines, in tandem with Marcos. Another way the US exhibits control is through the economy. As we've said, the Philippines is rich, so why are its people so poor? The Philippines is an import-oriented economy. The workers are underpaid and overworked, and they can't even enjoy the fruits of their own labor. One thing I learned in my AB orientation that still sticks with me to this day is that one of the Philippines' biggest exports is fish, and one of its biggest imports is frozen fish. That is of a much less quality than what they are producing in the Philippines. All of their labor, their resources are being sent out to uplift the imperialist countries. And another reason is that a lot of Filipinos don't own the land they work on. Since the majority of the country is made up of the peasantry and it is a semi-feudal society, there's a lot of people working on these lands under landlords, and they can enjoy the resources and the food from the land, since a lot of it all gets exported out to other countries. In migration, the Philippines doesn't just export its resources, it exports its people. This is mediated through the labor export policy. As a lot of us know, migrating abroad won't guarantee a better life. In different countries, migrants face exploitation and abuse, especially OFWs, overseas Filipino workers. They don't have the legal protections when working abroad. And a large portion of Filipinos do live abroad, 10% of them. And then 10% of the GDP in the Philippines is remittances, which is money being sent back to the Philippines from family members abroad. And there's also many social costs to migration, such as living in a country where there is racial violence, where you're away from your family, and where you have to compromise your native culture. This can be seen through Filipino Americans not knowing a Filipino language. The US military still has a stronghold in the Philippines. That's one thing the PHRA is fighting against. There are over 20 plus military bases and more facilities in the Philippines. There's military agreements in place that creates an uneven power structure where the US often has the upper hand in military affairs. An example of this would be the Visiting Forces Agreement. And this military presence also has a strong detrimental environmental impact. And as in many countries, the presence of the military has negative personal impacts. One of these would be, like a story of this would be of Jennifer Laude, which you can see pictured here, who was a trans Filipino woman who was assaulted and murdered by a US military personnel, and he eventually was pardoned for his crimes. And so these people were coming and committing these atrocious crimes, and there's no effects on them because of this imperialist control. In the Philippines has a large and diverse country, and there's lots of different indigenous groups and activists. These indigenous lands are forcibly stolen in order to mine and extract resources. These cultures are getting erased as well, and many of these languages have died. Lumad Bakwit, which I mentioned when discussing the Save Our Schools campaign, there are mobile makeshift schools for the displaced indigenous children. They're constantly under attack for simply trying to continue the practice of their culture of the Lumad people. The Philippines itself is one of the most dangerous countries for environmental defenders, many of which are indigenous people. There was a Kasama named Red Lee who did go to the Philippines for environmental activism, and there was an attempted assassination on him. He did survive, but there's definitely a large threat against those activists. The anti-terror law, which was passed by Rodrigo Duterte in July of 2020, leverages the term terrorist against activists and organizers and anyone who disagrees with him in order to justify the brutality that is being committed. Extrajudicial killings against lawyers and journalists also occur as they're seen as supporters of the resistance. There's also people within the church, there's priests, bishops, anyone who's speaking out who are also being murdered. The NTF-LCAC is also targeting legal democratic organizations such as BIAM, red tagging people, saying they're terrorists, saying they're communist, and also tweeting about the PHRA. And then we can go to the next slide. The control in the US also has a cultural imperialism. For centuries of colonization have lasting impacts on the culture of the Philippines. Some examples of these you can see is that there's colorism, believing that English is superior, not passing on Filipino languages to children. In a lot of schools, there's this pressure to teach English rather than Tagalog or other native languages. Believing the Philippines is corrupt, cannot be improved, believing that the US or Spain are seen as being saving the Philippines and making them more advanced, and believing that the Filipinos have to be hospitable, taken advantage of. Many of these false ideas that are being pressed upon by the United States. Oh, hold on. Okay, and so even with all this oppression, there's resistance. That's something you can see time and time again. 200 revolts against Spanish colonization, the Katipunan in the Revolution of 1896, the Hakbalahup during World War II, the Kabataan Anakbayan, the Communist Party of the Philippines, the New People's Army, all these centuries apart, people coming together to fight against the oppressors and the imperialists. Other things to make note of, Bayan, which is National Democratic Organization, was established in 1985. Anakbayan was established in the Philippines in 1998. And then AB Philly here was founded in 2020. So it's even happening today. The revolution is alive and it is fighting and is continuing very strongly onward. Okay. And so then we have a little activity that we're gonna do. It's kind of like a word cloud type of thing where Remy's gonna go over to the slide. You're gonna go to this website and type in this code, and you can put in words that make you think of answering this question. So how have you heard of US imperialist control in the Philippines? So go to menti.com and then type in that code, which I can also add into the chat. Thank you, Anlin, for adding that to the chat. Yeah, so some things people are saying, they've heard it in history classes, comrades in news. Some people are saying military agreements, military bases. I know something we've discussed in PSR in the past is that a lot of these like things about Philippine history you don't really hear in history class. And if you do, it's really cited towards the US as the savior of the Philippines rather than the Philippines being its own independent subjugated nation. One thing I keep seeing is like history class, but not as much as this presentation. That's why things like this is super important, because it's important to understand these histories, even if you're not Filipino. It's important to understand the history of oppressed people and be able to respect and engage in that culture and in that struggle. Yeah, some people mentioning families, family stories, hearing jokes about Filipino women and girls and the objectification of them. Some people are saying independent journalism. There's a lot of like really great journalists in the Philippines. One is Raplar, which works with Maria Ressa, who's a really cool activist in person, and there's a movie about her. All right. Yeah, we can move on to there's a second activity. We can move on to that because we're a little bit short on time. And then after that, we'll move on to part 4. So what are the root causes of poverty in the Philippines? Thank you for putting that in the chat on. Yeah, people are saying workers not owning land. Land is definitely like a big thing in the Philippines. And if you own it or if you don't. Yeah, that's one thing, no national industries. A question we get asked in our orientation is, do you know any like businesses that are solely Filipino? And there's really not any. A lot of these businesses that you would think of as Filipino are actually owned by overseas companies.
Rhiannon, you're muted.
Thank you. I was just saying that what Remy said in the chat, Jollibee is seen as a Filipino company, which it partially is, but also is not fully Filipino owned.
Should we move on to the next section?
Yep, I think we are
Wait,
good to
left a writing thing, sorry.
Good.
Okay. Thank you guys for contributing to the activity.
Yep.
Okay.
And I believe it is Turig going next, speaking about the 3 basic problems. So I'll hand it off to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So there are 3 basic problems facing Filipino society. The poverty, inequality, and violence faced by people living there basically stem from these 3 problems. So the first one is what we call bureaucrat capitalism. So the bureaucrat capitalists, a stratum of the national bourgeoisie that becomes very wealthy through corruption and monopoly enterprises. And of course, the grace of their American benefactors who would rather pocket, the money from their government offices than like actually provide for the people they claim to represent and fight for real democracy. There is a symbiotic relationship between US imperialism and the inequality seen there that has made Filipino society semi-colonial and semi-feudal. The landlords and their sons, brothers, and cousins in the government profit from looting the state treasury and exploiting the people they claim to represent. Those that aren't the products of nepotism become very wealthy through legal and extra-legal forms of bribery. They use this power to slash environmental regulations, expel peasants from their land, and send the army after activists. The privatization of public land is a major source of wealth for both bureaucrat capitalists and landlords. After the government seizes these lands for public works, they're often sold to landlords, mining magnates, and US corporations for basically nothing. And the bureaucrat capitalists, of course, receive massive kickbacks from this. So bureaucrat capitalists benefit from the status quo. So why would they want to change anything? Because their class interests are diametrically opposed to those of Filipino working classes, they can never be relied on to address any of these problems. Elements of this class fraction have branded themselves as basically everything, from populist to nationalist to even socialist, but their objective is pretty much always the same. As an example, so while Rodrigo Duterte ran for president on an anti-corruption platform in 2016, the Commission on Audit released a report finding deficiencies in the use of 67.3 billion Philippine pesos by the Department of Health in the fight against COVID-19, and another 41 billion that was originally appropriated to the Procurement Service Department of Budget and Management. So all allegations of misappropriation and calls to investigate have been met with total dismissal by the administration. And of course, because them and all of their political allies are profiting from this. The next problem is imperialism. So though the Spanish-American War was framed by proponents of US expansion as one to liberate oppressed people from Spanish colonial brutality, it was ultimately the result of American monopoly capital's maturation, the need to capture new markets and access new territories for natural resource extraction. By 1898, the US had already gained control of much of the northern part of South America and Central America. And Puerto Rico and Cuba, which had been lucrative agricultural and mining colonies for centuries, were also next on their list. Similarly, the Philippines was also a major objective for US foreign policy in the Asia Pacific region. They were able to seize it essentially through the opportunity that a war started out over arguably false pretext the Spanish-American War created. The US aligned itself with these liberal bourgeois nationalist elements and made promises of peace, cooperation, and goodwill, only to betray these promises by creating an American colonial regime. Throughout the early 20th century, the US Congress passed a series of laws increasing the power and influence of these compradors who could always rely on American guns to quell any unrest. A few examples of these laws are the Philippine Bill of 1902, the Jones Law of 1916, and the Tydings-McDuffie Law of 1934. The people of the Philippines naturally responded to this with armed resistance. And this armed resistance bred repression, which sort of increased intensified under the backdrop of the Cold War and the US policy of containment. So thanks to aid agreements and strategic cooperation efforts, such as the Joint US Military Assistance Group, or JUSMAG, the armed forces of the Philippines essentially act as a detachment of the US military receiving strategic and staff direction, logistics, training, and intelligence from US forces. US military advisors in the Philippines essentially exercise direct control over the AFP. Most of the military equipment and facilities of the AFP are granted on a loan basis by JustMac. The reason for this, of course, is to protect US interests. Because American monopoly capital still dominates the archipelago and maintains this looting through interference in Filipino affairs, this contradiction persists into today. The next problem is feudalism. So feudalism is a mode of production in which the principal forces of production are the land and the peasants who are exploited primarily through rent as opposed to wage labor. When we say that the political economy of the Philippines retains feudal characteristics, we mean to say that the prevailing forms of exploitation are those found in feudal economies, even though surplus labor is being appropriated as profit vis-a-vis rents. So because land is concentrated in the hands of a privileged few, large swaths of the rural population make their living as tenant farmers. After a poor harvest or a decline in the price of a crop, many of these farmers fall into debt, lose their tenancy, and either migrate to the city or become day laborers. Usury, exploitative rents, and land grabbing enlarge this growing surplus population and create an even more exploitable labor force. Virtually every land reform program enacted by the various puppet regimes has resulted in dispossession and large-scale land grabbing by US corporations. At the height of the Peasant War of 1950, the Land Settlement Development Corporation, or LASEDECO, was organized to resettle landless peasants, who were dispossessed by this land grabbing. But in its 3 years of existence, LASEDECO resettled no more than 400 peasant families. These conditions, along with the failure of land reform, has generated waves of militancy that have often been punctuated by state repression. One of the most infamous instances of this was the 1987 Mendiola massacre, where state security forces violently dispersed a group of peaceful marchers protesting the government's lack of action on the land question. And this kind of violence continues on into today. The terrible conditions that people living there have to experience all stem from these three problems and are ultimately maintained by the US's presence there, and of course the funding they provide to the AFP. I guess we're going to move on to the next section now.
Well, thanks, Derek. So this next section will talk about sort of the national democratic movement's perspective, sort of like talk about like what are the solutions to these three basic problems of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucratic capitalism. Can go to the next slide. So as we said before, Anakbayan Philadelphia is part of Anakbayan USA, and that is seated in the national democratic movement for the Philippines. And what we mean by national democratic is that we must overthrow the three basic problems to establish a national democracy with a socialist perspective. The people must overthrow the reactionary state and replace it with a new state created by the masses that would establish a free, just, and progressive society. And national independence, national meaning that to assert national sovereignty and gain genuine independence against US imperialism and its local puppets. And democratic, meaning supporting the democratic rights and struggles of the masses, the majority of whom are peasants and support in their fight for land. To next slide. And so now I'm going to talk about sort of the two different types of struggle that are waged in the Philippines. The first being the armed struggle. There's a strong armed struggle in the Philippines for national democracy. Though Anakbayan is not affiliated with the Communist Party of the Philippines, the New People's Army, and the NDF, both armed and legal struggle work towards similar goals, and that is where the two forms of struggle intersect. In the next section, we'll talk more about the more primary form of struggle, which is the legal struggle. But we do acknowledge the prevalence of armed struggle in the Philippines. And in here, we'll talk about the legal struggle, which includes mass actions, demonstrations, forums, rallies, marches, press conferences, etc. On the right, we've identified a few formations, one being Bayan in the Philippines, as well as Bayan USA. Established in 2005 as the first overseas chapter of Bayan and overseas chapters in various regions of the US, including the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, Southern California, Midwest, and US in the Northeast. And on the bottom is the Anakbayan Coalition, established in 2009 to represent the voice of the national democratic movement in the congressional arena of struggle, so in politics, which participates in the presidential election to support pro-people and democratic programs. Essentially, the goal is to displace the most reactionary candidates and politicians to move forward the national democratic movement, although as an organized force. And going on to the next section, sort of like, why do we participate in the parliamentary struggle? We have to draw the difference between reform and revolution, especially with the 2022 elections quickly approaching. And so while Bayan and the Progressive Party List work together to defeat the Marcos Duterte tandem and continuing to fight for the people's demands for change, Bayan's role is to bring to the forefront the issues of the mass movement and to expose and oppose the broken system of the ruling class. Like, we know that it is impossible to change the ruling system through periodic elections. Under the rules set by the exploiting classes and their political agents. And so, like, Bayan's role is different than of the party list. So yeah, I think we're familiar with the ideas, the differences between reform and revolution. So yeah, here are some more points. In the arena of politics, the goal is to build a people's democratic government supported by the people and supporting their interests. In the economy, to build a self-reliant economy and carry out national industrialization, which Rhiannon has talked about before, about how the Philippines has no national industries, achieve genuine agrarian reform, land reform, and redistribution of the land. The arena of military, a revolutionary army to serve the people and defend them against their enemies, and a culture to promote a national, scientific, pro-people culture to combat the feudal, anti-people, and imperialist culture. Cool.
Hello, comrades. I'm on Lin Wang again. And thanks for sticking with us until the end. I'll be closing out this this final section of this presentation here. And so I want to talk about the connections between the Philippines to Philadelphia today. If I could get the next slide. Thanks for sticking through this. I know I learned a lot tonight, and I hope others did too. But I'm sure y'all are asking now, so what? What's this mean for me? What difference, if any, can I make here? Why is a Filipino diaspora group talking to a DSA chapter in Philadelphia? What's the purpose there? So I want to speak to that a little bit. You know, I'm a member of the International Committee. I certainly care about internationalism as a concept. What does that actually mean for us? Well, for one thing, I think by being here, that's already one important step of it. By being here, that allows us to be in the process. By thinking about this topic, that allows us to be in the process of making connections between the Philippine struggle and the struggle here in the United States. If I get the next slide, for one thing, take the creation of the Pennsylvania State Police. A lot of people know that the Pennsylvania State Police was founded as a strike-breaking force, as a force against organized labor. What's less known is that the tactics that they imported were actually brought over from the occupation of the Philippines. The creation of the state police was done because local sheriffs were not willing to use brutal enough violence on their neighbors and friends who were organizing against harsh and unjust working conditions. So they created the Pennsylvania State Police, and they imported the methods of oppression and occupation from abroad and used that and imported that right back home here in the United States to oppress workers here. More directly to these days, it's also the case that we just have a number of direct ties to the struggle right now. There's a Pennsylvania Congresswoman, for example, who introduced or reintroduced the Philippine Human Rights Act, which is a bill in Congress that would cease U.S. funding to the U.S. support for U.S. military aid funding to the Philippines until they meet certain conditions. And just for some scale of that, the United States has offered the Philippines over $2.5 billion in funding and weapons since Rodrigo Duterte took power in 2016. For some scale of that in the context of us here in Philly, the entire federal government gave the entire city of Philadelphia $1.5 billion in aid, for COVID. So I want folks to sit with that and have some understanding of the scale of the oppression that our country is complicit in and engages directly in the Philippines. So as far as what that means for us, if I get the next slide, we have a role to play as organizers and socialists and anti-imperialists right here in the heart of empire. The United States ruling class, it has since the occupation of the Philippines, always maintained a tight ties between our ruling class and theirs, probably enshrined most obviously vis-a-vis the alliances that we make with the autocratic regimes there. So on top of that, just to bring that the issue back home to Philly, right in here in Philly, it's also the case that Filipinos, the Filipino diaspora, faces disenfranchisement. The Philadelphia City Commissioner's Office, for example, does not readily make available voting materials in Filipino languages, for example. Right. So all that's to say, there is plenty of work we can do right here, right now, in solidarity and support with the Filipino diaspora. Broadly speaking, I think we could sort of categorize these the three sort of categories: arouse, organize, and mobilize. What do I mean by that? Well, for one thing, it's important for us to cultivate and develop interest and familiarity with the Philippine struggle. At the end of the day, there is a global struggle. This has to be a global workers' movement. You can't just have national socialism. You need to have an international proletariat that's in power. And learning about Philippines history helps makes that clear to us here in the empire that our struggles are one and the same for workers at the end of the day. And as far as developing that, you might be thinking, well, how am I supposed to what does learning about this history have to do with, how do I just, where do I even begin? I think it's okay just to start with even like current events. Just in a few weeks, there's a very big one coming up. There's the presidential elections in just a few weeks, which occur every 5 years. So this is a really historic election. And more on what we can do about that as Americans in just a moment. Finally, on this, I want to just boost again those news sources that Rhiannon named earlier. Rappler.com and ABS-CBN. You can just Google these. You can find them on social media. Just great news sites. You just subscribe to it. You'll start seeing seeing this content come on your feed. It's good stuff and enlightening stuff. I highly recommend folks do that. And I guess actually one other thing I want to promote here. I see the icon there. If you're interested in this, there's an organization called Malaya, which has a good introduction on the Philippines elections this year. I can drop a link in the chat later, but if someone else wants to do it, that'd be great too. It's on YouTube as well. All right, organize. Now this is the one this is the one I suspect that most people would guess would be on here. It's important for us to educate our own comrades about this, right? So you attend, it's great that you attended this webinar tonight. I hope you got a lot out of it. But it's going to be even better if you can take that back to your friends and other comrades and even your family, right? This is where it starts. It starts with one-on-one conversations to grow awareness of U.S. involvement in the Philippines and the struggle that goes on to this day. And from there, hopefully, the movement, the Filipino American Worker Solidarity. What can you do on the organizing front right now? Well, for one thing, you can amplify the call for national democracy with other DSA chapters. You can get connected with the broad anti-imperial front. And if you look at the slides, there names a number of different other different Filipino diaspora orgs in the United States, including Bayan, Migrante, Gabriela, the Malaya movement. They're the ones who did the intro to the Philippines election video. The International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, and the Kabatan Alliance. We're going to go back to the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines in just a sec, otherwise known as ICHR. Okay. A couple things you can do more or less right now. You can endorse the Philippine Human Rights Act legislation. So I'm going to drop a link to that in the chat. Please sign this. It'll boost the number. It'll boost the number of public of supporters that they can claim. And even though it's going to probably require a new bill after the presidential election, either way, we should be supporting this legislation and whatever new iteration of it hopefully comes up once the new regime is in power. Next. This is what I'm very excited about. The elections in the Philippines are on May 9th. ICHR is organizing an international delegation to help observe the election. This is very important because what that'll do is it provides more international eyes on the whole process, which hopefully improves the general safety of people who are organizing there, who are voters who are maybe in opposition to a local elites that are in power. And to that extent, you can actually you can learn more about it, and you can actually sign up to attend through this link that I just dropped in the chat on the iChirp website. It's not too late to sign up to go. I know this might be a lot to plan a trip to the Philippines within just a few weeks. But I'm confident that if you're able to go, this one's going to be worth it. This is part of the process of building ties between the American left, us in the heart of the empire, and those in other countries who our country is putting its boot on the neck. So, and actually, as it stands, one of our comrades here in PhillyDSA is also going to be going to observe. Comrade Tarig, who presented earlier. You can please donate to support Tarig's to help fundraise for Tarig's for Tarig's to go on the International Observer Delegation. It'll be a really big deal if DSA could have a member there, have a presence there, and hopefully make some more connections. Last thing I'll plug real quick is to also join Anakbayan Philly. You don't have to be a Filipino to apply. Anyone can join. And I encourage people to do so to help build ties, DSA-AB solidarity, build American Philippine solidarity. They do great work, and we should be. And I'm very grateful to them for helping us organize this event tonight. You can also follow them on social media through the handles in the slides as well. Last thing I'm going to plug real quick is to join DSA's International Committee as well. We're an endorser of the Human Rights of the Philippine Human Rights Act. We are the national committee for DSA that helps work on international issues on behalf of DSA. And I'm very hopeful, and I'm very excited about collaboration with Bayan and the national democracy movement moving forward. You can apply at dsa.org/apply and also follow us on social media at the handles listed there. With that, let me pass it to the person that's going to close us out.
Hello, thank you, Onlin. I will be closing us out. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Feel free to stay. We have like a bunch of extra time, so feel free to stay for questions or to discuss anything that's on your mind. Not anything, but I guess if you had some like interpersonal problems you wanted to share, you know, no, just kidding. Anyway, thank you for coming. You can contact us at anakbayanphilly@gmail if you have any questions. You can follow us on Instagram. That'd be pretty important if you want to come to any actions or events, because we do post on there. We're not really like Twitter people. Leftists that aren't on Twitter. Oh my God. No, I'm just kidding. But actually, we don't really use Twitter. So please follow us on Instagram. And then if you want to donate to support our work, you can Venmo our finance officer at Astrid-Dong. And yeah, if you want to donate to Tarig specifically, just write TR, just so we can like separate that. So now I'm going to close this out with a bug suck, which basically is this thing that we do in the movement. And it originated during the United Farm Workers movement to express solidarity between different farm workers. So basically uniting everyone under a common goal. And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to say like it's kind of like a manifestation. And then I'm going to go Isang Bagsak, and then we all clap. You can do it muted or unmuted, whatever feels right to you. So I guess I'll say it. Here is to working towards more international solidarity, working together as DSA and AB, and also whoever else is here. If you're not in an organization, working with you guys too, and learning more so that we can all achieve liberation, I guess. So yeah, Isang Bagsak. Yay. It's kind of awkward over Zoom, but you know, yeah. Again, thank you for coming. You can direct questions to Instagram or Gmail, and then we can also open the floor to questions now if people feel like answering questions or saying anything that's on your mind. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, actually, I did have a question. Hi.
Yeah.
I was wondering, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so I know there was a slide recently where it mentioned the how much military aid was given to the Philippines. I know, like, since 2016, I know that when Trump was president, we had a pretty cozy relationship with Duterte. Do you know if that number was typical, if there was more military aid given during those Trump years, or you know how it's changed over the last couple of let's say the last decade or so?
Yeah, I would say there's always been a very strong like military, like foothold of the like American military in the Philippines. I don't know, like as I mentioned, like at the very beginning of like US colonization, one of their main tactics was to build up their army. And yeah, like Nina slash question just said in the chat, they were typical. Biden is even increasing the amount of aid and weapon sales this year. So hopefully that answers the question. I would say it's always been the basis of like control, and the like funding has pretty much just increased over time, unfortunately. And then yeah, more info on election interfering and voter suppression. Should we share some resources about that, or we can say like just verbally right now, or both, like more information about voter suppression? If any other Kasamas would like to talk about that issue, I can maybe share some links.
Yeah, I can mention. So one thing that some of the other like Kasamas have been really pushing recently is that overseas voting began a couple weeks ago, and no one received their ballot until weeks after. Some people still haven't received their ballot, which is really delaying the process for overseas voters here and oppressing people's votes. There's also instances of some people getting their ballots and they already have like Duterte Marcos shaded in for the voting spots. And I know Nina may be able to talk about this more because this was up in New York, but there was like a coalition of anti-Duterte, anti-Marcos supporters who wrote a letter to the Philippine consulate asking for their ballots to come and calling the Philippine consulate out on them not doing their jobs blatantly. And now I believe there's like a live stream that's up of the people putting the ballots to be sent out, but there's only like 3 people who are doing this while like the upper heads of the consulate aren't doing anything and just like overworking these consulate workers sending out the ballots. And Nina added, or questions added, some good information in the chat for people to check out.
Yeah, just to give some context, there is an effort called Contra Daya, which is like against cheating. That's what the translation is. And they're calling for just what do you call it? Collecting forms or complaints from different people, Filipino voters on like their experience with the ballots. So yeah, there's the form and then also internal FAQ and a Facebook post. So if you know of any Filipino voters who are trying to get their experiences and just, yeah. So on either side of the aisle, right? So BBM supporters or Lenny supporters or whatever, they all haven't been able to get their ballots on time. So right now, I think they've only sent out 82% of overseas absentee voter ballots. And it's already been like weeks into voting.
Yeah, and I think also to just, hi, I'm Iris. I'm in the Anakbayan, a different Anakbayan in New Jersey. But like, yeah, another thing about the vote buying is that it's like, even though it's clearly kind of like a violation of the, democracy of like these elections, and it all seems to be in Marcos Duterte's favor, there have been complaints registered, but really no like action by the rest of the Philippine bureaucracy to, hold them accountable or like, be like, stop that. Like, it's like, I think I just opened an article. It's like, Kamalek to wait for proper complaint after alleged vote buying at Marcos rally. It's like, I don't know. It's like, they're kind of like ignoring complaints, like, and ignoring the fact that this is obviously happening. And there have been like so many complaints kind of levied. So it's like, part of it is Marcos Duterte, of course, but there's also this whole, system of bureaucracy that is supporting this vote buying and supporting this corruption.
Are there any other questions about elections or other things that were brought up? Yeah. Also, thank you, Iris.
Yeah, I guess one thing that would be great to talk about is just like, what would it look like to bring a PHRA campaign here in Philly? Or like if folks have ideas on how to collaborate. I don't know if any other attendees are with orgs outside of DSA. But yeah, I think the ND movement is relatively new in Philadelphia. So we'd love to just like start making schemes, on how to, making plans on how to, organize more in Philly. If folks have any thoughts on that.
Hey, I have not necessarily a thought, and I don't mean it to be a plug, but just in the conversation of organizing. I know folks from NJ for PHRA are outreaching to AB chapters to see, to kind of like collectivize where folks are out with their organizing, and figure out, like test the waters for like how student organizing has been and how to connect the chapters around the PHRA if folks are interested. We haven't set like a meeting, we're just kind of like outreaching individually to folks, but if that's like on your radar, I think that'll be coming up soon. Also, thank you so much for this. I know this was an abridged version, but this was like super dense and wonderful.
Thank you, Mary. Astrid, no. Bad.
Take over. That's what y'all should do. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say more New Jersey taking over the conversation.
Yes. No, I'm kidding.
Just kidding. But like, yeah, just like different tactics that people have done. Like, I know in Jersey City, they were able to pass a resolution through the council, the like city government that supported the PHRA. And it wasn't just like, okay, we support the PHRA. It was also like, it was kind of like an extension of because Jersey City is a sanctuary city. So it's like a kind of an extension of that policy saying like, oh, because the anti-terror law in the Philippines can actually affect people or like Philippine citizens in the US. So I think they were kind of saying like, we will protect like Jersey City residents from those kinds of attacks. And we support the PHRA. So yeah, and I know a lot of different cities and like some college campuses have tried to do like passing a resolution. So that's one common tactic that people have used. But yeah.
I don't know if Aaron, you're trying to talk. Oh, sorry. Okay. Nice kitty. Yeah, it would be great to brainstorm more about targets in Philly, what would make sense, like city resolution or like passing a university resolution at a campus or something like that. Because, you know, this is our taxpayer money that's going towards human rights abuses in the Philippines and all over the world.
Yeah, going off of that mentioning of like people supporting the PHRA, there's the National Lawyers Guild chapter at Drexel University is signing to endorse the PHRA. So like university orgs can sign on to endorse the PHRA. So there's a lot of different facets of people who can support, who can endorse, in many ways to like engage with it.
Yeah, if people are interested in doing like more work about like the PHRA and stuff, you can always send us an email and maybe like Lynn and I or something could organize some sort of like meeting or coalition of some kind that's like sort of like a cross organizational group of people. Oh my gosh, I can't believe there's another person from Arizona on this call. Slay. Okay, sorry, I got distracted. But yeah, you get the idea. So you can always contact us and we can throw something together. That's another idea. Yeah.
To me, a suggestion about the other question, you know, about potential other places to organize. You know, I think it would, you know, and there might be a potential to target groups of constituents, you know, in the districts of Congress people that are members of the Foreign Affairs Committee. We have at least like two of them in like the borders of like what constitutes PhillyDSA. So maybe one possibility could be to convene a committee to lobby the church groups, progressive formations that exist out there, youth places like universities and stuff, to try and organize people to reach out and lobby their own Congress people. Just an idea I had, but I'm obviously happy to chat more about it and maybe flesh that out more. Maybe it's even a bad idea, but it's an idea I thought of just now.
Yeah, that'd be great. Sorry, another thing that I just thought about was the Philippines is not very much, it's not very prominent in terms of like issues in the US left. So if you have like a media platform and you want to write like an op-ed or create some content about the Philippine movement, I think that would be greatly helpful. I think the elections that are coming up does have big implications on the anti-imperialist movement, and especially in terms of like the dual tactics between like mass movement building and engaging in elections. So it might be interesting to explore as like DSA or other organizations to write something about the Philippines and be in solidarity with the Philippine movement. I think the more amplification we can get, the better for sure. Do y'all have any blogs or Twitter clout? That would be greatly, greatly appreciated.
Yeah, and like you don't have to be an expert or anything. Like if anyone like feels intimidated about like speaking with authority on this subject when you don't like, maybe this is like your first exposure to it or something, like Kasamas can help if you connect with us and we can guide you and things like that. So don't feel like imposter syndrome or anything. Like we really appreciate any sort of help and we're willing to build with you if you don't feel like qualified. You know what I mean?
Oh, I also want to respect the silence, but I also just want to outburst and say the connection with the like Pennsylvania police. I didn't know that fact. That was super duper interesting. And I know there's like a lot of connections with funding like state police in the US, but I didn't realize that link to PA state police being like completely mimicked off what was happening in the Philippines.
Yeah, that's from the book End of Policing, actually, which describes that. And then Nina said in the chat, would anyone be interested in coming to New York for any of the mobilizations? They're very fun. If anyone has ever been to a big mobilization in New York, whether it's for the Philippines or something else, they tend to be very grounding. Yeah. Yeah, and there'll be a mobilization regardless of who wins, whether it's Marcos, which is going to be like people power vibes, or if it's Lenny, which will still be like revolution vibes, you know, keeping it going. Oh, David, you are interested. Ooh, yay, David.
This is kind of random, but like putting the things that happen in the Philippines and have like contributed to some of the like poverty and conditions, like in a bigger context of like patterns that we see with colonialization. The little tidbit about like the Philippines' biggest import being frozen fish and the biggest export being like fresh fish really reminded me a lot of like the causes of the potato famine in Ireland. Like colonial powers often will use a colony like that as a source of like food and like very rich like farming land for crops and exports, and then like they have like one staple food, or like they have to import all of their food, and then if something with that goes bad, you have like a whole genocide. Like, you know, I don't know where I'm going.
Carrie, I mentioned that. I messaged Nina that. I was like, oh, Nina, this like reminds me of stuff I learned about like Ireland and how the potato famine really isn't a famine, and how there was food, but like the Irish people couldn't access it. So there was like a genocide. And like what I told Nina, I was like, this really just like makes it so clear how important national solidarity is, because it's like we're all affected by this, like as people of like working class, like this imperialism, capitalism is harming all of us. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was like what I was thinking this whole time.
Well, are there notes being taken? Sorry, I realized there was like so many great ideas. And I mean, I guess we have a recording, but I think it'd be great to follow up on these ideas.
Yeah, I think we didn't anticipate having brainstorming time because we thought we were going to use all the time for the actual speaking part. So this part's very informal for that reason, but maybe we could task someone after this, someone in DSA or in AB, to like write some of these things down. And yes, we can download the chat as well. Yeah. Is there anything else, or should we close out for the evening?
I just want to say I appreciated the space a lot. Thank you, DSA, and looking forward to building the movement in Philly. Yeah, and just grateful for all of the great ideas.
Yes, thank you, DSA, for providing this platform. Actually, do the DSA folks have time to stay on for a couple minutes after this, just so I could organize a time to debrief? Okay, cool. Cool. Okay, well, I guess folks are free to go. Thank you for attending. Please attend more things in the future. Yeah.
Thank you all. Have a good night.